Welcome. We're delighted you could join us today. We've put together this webinar on creating diagnostic and prescriptive reading groups that work to help teachers or tutors fine-tune their current reading groups, ensure that they're running smoothly, and most importantly, meeting the needs of all students, including those with dyslexia. The information found in this webinar is based on research and the science of reading. We know how busy classroom teachers are, and we've provided PowerPoints that you can use immediately in your classroom, as well as some other materials. We've also provided a workbook that you can use where you can take notes and jot down any questions that you may have. Thank you for choosing the Orton Gillingham Online Academy, and we look forward to spending the next 60 minutes with you. The aim of this webinar is to help teachers critically examine their current reading practice and ensure that it's based on the science of reading, investigate the common mistakes in reading group sessions, and find ways to remedy these common problems so you can effectively reach all of our readers, including those with dyslexia, find ways to support all readers during small group reading sessions based on the advice of top experts in the field of reading and dyslexia, guide teachers on how to set up small reading groups using a diagnostic and prescriptive approach, guide teachers how to plan their sessions using this diagnostic and prescriptive approach, inform teachers on what to look for in reading programs based on the science of reading, and provide some ideas for comprehension, fluency, vocabulary, and word work. Take a moment to read what this webinar will explore. You'll notice throughout the webinar there will be a small stamp that says bonus. If you see this, there'll be bonus materials in your handouts. Before we get into the webinar, take a couple minutes to complete this pre-test in your workbook. At the end of the webinar, you can complete the post-test to find out what you've learned and understood from this webinar. This will help with the retention of the material presented here today. In our reading instruction, we need to have the following 5 reading components, otherwise known as the Big Five. These components are based on the National Reading Panel report and based on decades of scientific research, as well as the IDA's Structured Literacy 5 critical areas. Let's briefly examine the 5 critical elements of reading instruction. We'll first start with phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics. Now, there's a lot of confusion over these terms. They're related like a family, but they're different. So we'll just briefly go over these. Let's take a look at phonological awareness first. What word is similar that you already know in the word phonological? It's the word phone. And what sense do we need to have to listen to a phone? It's our hearing. So phonological awareness requires our auditory skills, just like you need to listen to the sound of this motorcycle. In your workbook, you'll find a mind map, and that mind map will have a small circle that says phonological awareness. Right above this, just draw an ear above that circle. This will help you remember that phonological awareness actually requires our hearing. It allows kids to recognize and work with the sounds of spoken language and has nothing to do with seeing the letters and even knowing what sounds these letters make. It involves rhyming words, counting syllables, and noticing how sounds repeat themselves. Syllabication, the number of words in a sentence, alliteration, onset and rhyme. Now, phonemic awareness is the subset of phonological awareness, in which listeners can hear and identify and manipulate phonemes, which are the smallest units of sound. So, for example, if we said to a child, separate or segment the spoken word of cat into the 3 sounds that they hear. So k, a, t. Or to blend the three sounds of k, at, which makes the word cat. So it's specific to the individual sounds that you hear. You can also play games with children for phonemic awareness where they have to remove sounds. So, for example, if I said to a child, I have the word bit and I need to remove the b sound, what word is left? It would be it. This is phonemic awareness. The next essential ingredient to our reading instruction is phonics, and this is when we're introducing print and mapping our speech to print and learning that the sounds and letters go together. Once your children know this, they're learning the alphabetic principle. They're also learning rules and patterns of letters and sound relationships. This is essential for children to learn to read. Cumulative, explicit, systematic instruction that incorporates multi-sensory learning, like the Orton-Gillingham approach, helps all children learn to read and helps our struggling readers. It helps them read and spell more accurately and fluently. Dr. Louisa Moats reports that phonics is critical for preventing reading failure in children at risk. Reading fluency is our next ingredient. There is sufficient evidence that shows that there's a direct connection between fluency and reading comprehension. Any one of us can attest that when we read slower, for example, if we're learning a new language or we're learning a new topic and we've seen words that are unfamiliar, our comprehension does decrease. So it's imperative that we teach our children in the classroom how to read fluently. And this doesn't only include accuracy and our reading rate, we must also teach them that phrasing, expression, and punctuation are also important components of fluent reading. Dr. Louisa Moats, a renowned expert in reading development and instruction, reports that vocabulary development is best achieved by reading, oral language practice, and instruction in a wide range of topics. We need to know that reading comprehension largely depends on our knowledge of word meanings, so understanding the words in a text. How often have you read a text or a passage where you are unfamiliar with various vocabulary? If you're unfamiliar, you're not going to be able to understand the text, nor will you remember that vocabulary because you can't make that connection. So we need repeated exposure to these words, and this is especially important for our students with dyslexia. And of course, we need explicit, direct instruction of word meanings. And we'll talk a little later on how to provide explicit and direct instruction to our students. The end goal of reading is comprehension. So we need to explicitly teach our children the skills and the strategies that are necessary to understand text and to apply this not only during our reading sessions, but throughout the day. So now we understand the 5 main components of reading instruction, or the Big 5. And now we're going to take a look at the 2 main reading approaches to reading. They're the scientifically based reading research and whole language derivatives. And this information comes from Dr. Louisa Moats. This chart here illustrates the comparison of the 2 approaches as it relates to the Big 5. Now, what I'd like you to try to do here is, in your workbook, you will see the same chart. Take a minute and highlight the areas of how you approach your reading instruction. And once you've gone through this and you've highlighted all the way to the bottom from phonological awareness to the writing, you'll be able to see which approach you more closely align with. So which approach does your reading instruction follow? Does it follow the science-based reading research or whole language? We'll take a look now at the different approaches that are commonly used in the classroom. So we've looked at the 2 common approaches to teaching reading. Now we're going to look at the common reading instructional practices that are used in the classroom or in your small group tutoring sessions. These include guided reading, strategy groups, structured literacy, writing workshop, and balanced literacy. Here you'll see the different instructional practices of reading that are found in many of the classrooms today. Whichever approach you're using in your small group or individual group sessions, you must determine whether it's backed up by the science of reading. Is it backed up by evidence and research of best practice? And most importantly, is it reaching all of your students? Is it reaching those students with dyslexia? I can tell you when I was in the classroom, I used most of the approaches here. I blended them. I was trying to find ways to reach my students, but I was still missing a piece of the puzzle with my students with dyslexia. And the missing element was the Orton-Gillingham approach. This approach should be the front and center of your reading instruction. So we've just investigated some of the different instructional practices that we commonly see in the classroom. We've also looked at the two different approaches to reading instruction, whole language and the scientific-based reading research. Now, think about the instructional approach that you use either in your classroom or in your tutoring session. Which one of those instructional practices follows the science of reading? Write down any questions you might have. Any questions that aren't answered can be directed in the discussion forum. Let's take a look further at some other questions you can ask yourself. Jot your responses in your workbook. Which instructional practice do you follow in your small group, whole class reading sessions? Guided reading, reading workshop, strategy reading groups, structured literacy, or balanced literacy? Does the approach that you are following implement the 5 essential elements of reading, otherwise known as the Big Five? Does the approach that you are using follow the path of science-based reading instruction or whole language? Is the approach that you're using effectively reaching all of your students, including those with dyslexia, and are they making progress? Do you think it is important to continually evaluate your reading practice, and why? Now we're going to take a look at the top 9 mistakes that teachers make in their small reading groups or in their reading instruction and how to fix them. These errors are based on the literature of the top reading experts in the field of reading. The number 1 mistake is lacking awareness. It really doesn't matter what the other mistakes are if you aren't able to take a clear look at yourself. Looking at your personality, your strengths, your weaknesses, your thoughts, your beliefs, the motivation and the emotions that you have that are related to your teaching. Remember, we can't change what we don't acknowledge within ourselves. In order to be more self-aware, we need to take a look at ourselves. An honest self-evaluation is required in order to grow in our practice. It's pretty simple. Being reflective, looking at our instruction, and identifying areas that are working and not working, and how it increases or impedes the growth of our students is very important. I've actually videotaped my lessons and observed what was really going on. Sometimes we're not able to see what we are doing, so a mirror or a video of another person can be very helpful. And when you see these mistakes, celebrate them. This is where change happens, providing you acknowledge it with a plan for the future. The second mistake is using a reading program that is not based on the science of reading. If you're unsure whether or not the approach or the program that you're following is based on the science of reading, just take a look at some of the questions that you can ask yourself. You'll find these questions in the workbook, and you can highlight or circle yes or no. Take a minute to complete this now. If you've answered yes to any of these questions, it may be likely that the program or the approach that you are following is not based on the science of reading. Next, we'll look at a solution for the programs that you can look for that follow the science of reading. If you've answered yes to any of the questions that we've just looked at, it's important to look at your approach and consider some changes. Look for programs that use direct systematic teaching, have valid screening measures, provide early instruction in phonology and oral language, word recognition, fluency, comprehension, and writing skills. Look for programs that provide explicit, organized instruction that is multisensory, that weaves in several components of the English language. Look for programs that build in fluency and incorporate phonemic awareness in all reading instruction rather than something that's isolated. Look for programs that have lessons on word structures and origin and don't only focus on phonics. Look for programs that focus on a deep understanding of topics and themes, as well as explicitly teaching comprehension and vocabulary. Dr. Sally Shaywitz and Dr. Louisa Moats caution educators to be aware of programs that claim they are scientifically based. Any programs that use 3 cueing systems primarily use teaching, modeling, and read alouds as instructions. Any programs that do not use systematic or explicit phonics, spelling, and grammar instruction, confuse phonemic awareness with phonics, rely on leveled books or trade books only for instruction, or use whole language for ELL learners need to be reassessed. Be aware of these programs that say they are based on science. Investigate. Ask yourself, is there scientific evidence that program is effective? Ask for articles or peer-reviewed journals based on that program that you plan on using. Testimonials are great, but they are not based on science and evidence. The third mistake is poor planning. Poor planning is a result of either a lack of awareness, a lack of training, or being overwhelmed and just kind of winging it. How do you know if your planning is poor? Do you follow a program that's generic in nature? Is your plan based on covering curriculum objectives rather than uncovering student needs? Do you follow plans that are a culmination of just teacher-made ideas? Do you fake plan and just kind of hope for the best? Do you plan around your centers? Are those your plan? Or do you not really know what to do and don't plan? Just sit and listen to the child or children and read and just hope that this practice works. If you've answered yes to any of this question, planning might be an area that you need to focus on. As a teacher in the classroom, there are areas in this checklist that I have answered yes to, but it's knowing the areas that I've identified and then remediated those areas in order to best help my children. So one of the solutions to poor planning is to be diagnostic and prescriptive, to take the needs of your students and base your planning around that. So for example, you'll assess your students, you'll find out what the needs are. So you might have a group of students who need work on fluency, for example. You'll determine that their reading rate is quite slow. So this is the diagnostic part, so that's the rate, which is the help that they need. Then you will teach them or give them a strategy on how to teach them to increase their reading rate. So you might use repeated reading. Progress monitoring is where you'll look and see if this is actually helping. So you'll have a baseline on their reading rate, and you'll determine in 2 to 3 weeks if what you are doing is actually helping them. So keep in mind, being diagnostic and prescriptive is using your observations about problem areas to determine what areas you need to explicitly instruct, so that your course of instruction is highly individualized for your students. This is based on structured literacy principle. If you combine this with a program that is backed with science, you're nearly there. The second solution is to be systematic and cumulative in your planning. So what does this mean? When you start planning, your sequencing must begin with the easiest and most basic concepts, and then you move to the more difficult material. Each concept must be also based on those that are already learned, and the concepts that are taught must be reviewed to strengthen to the memory. This also ensures that there are no gaps. This is one of the principles of the Orton-Gillingham approach, which also follows structured literacy. Lack of teacher education in the science of reading leads to poor planning. Students who are not making progress are generally not being provided the instruction that they need to learn to read. I've been in this situation where a few of my students in my class were not making progress. My son, who also has dyslexia, was also falling further and further behind. Although I had a master's and a bachelor's of education, it was still not enough. I started to read, I looked at the best evidence and research-based programs that provided the best outcomes for these children, and I learned my missing piece was the Orton-Gillingham approach, which is under that umbrella of structured literacy. Once I learned this approach, I was able to teach my son and my students, and they soon were beginning to learn to read. The Orton-Gillingham Online Academy provides the instruction to help parents, tutors, and teachers learn how the English language is taught and how to plan in order to meet the needs of our struggling students. Please do not confuse a diagnostic and prescriptive approach with a plug-in approach. Diagnostic prescriptive instruction is intended to meet the needs of individual students. This doesn't mean that the student is tested on a skill and then assigned a workbook or an exercise to develop the skill and then tested later. Instruction like this is called a plug-in approach or a Band-Aid approach. In order to avoid this, instruction should follow explicit and direct instruction that's based on systematic and cumulative planning. This provides our students with these opportunities to apply the skills that we have taught them. The fourth mistake is a lack of explicit and direct instruction. When a teacher provides explicit instruction, he or she models or demonstrates the skills or strategies that they want to teach. They provide clear descriptions of new concepts, providing both examples and non-examples. Explicit instruction on teaching sounds, comprehension, and fluency is absolutely essential in teaching reading. Keep in mind that explicit instruction is not only for teaching academic concepts, but can also be for teaching behaviors and procedures. For example, a teacher who is explicitly teaching first grade students to sound out words will demonstrate the process step by step. They'll provide opportunities for students to practice the skill with the teacher's feedback and support. And if the student is not successful, the teacher will model again. The teacher may have the student sound out a few words along with him or her. Eventually, the student will apply the skill independently to sound out simple words. Students who are easily confused are more likely to be successful when the teacher demonstrates and clearly explains what they need to learn. On the other hand, if confusions are not addressed and foundational skills are not mastered, it's likely that students will become more and more confused, resulting in more serious reading issues. Not only is explicit instruction excellent for teaching reading, it's also wonderful for teaching procedures and routines. The fifth mistake is poor pace. Pace refers to the time it takes for your lessons and not getting through them efficiently. Part of this can be resolved with teaching your class procedures and behaviors that you expect. Once procedures are in place and you've explicitly taught your students what they are responsible for and provided practice and coaching, there will be little off-task behavior. So that leaves the time issue with you. I've stressed because one of my biggest weaknesses are my pace or timing. So I draw up a small plan that gives me approximate times so I know where to focus And the biggest thing I use is a timer. This helps me. I also tell my students that this is the one area that I need to work on, so I use timers to help me, and it also helps them learn time management. The sixth mistake is following a traditional guided reading or reading workshop approach. Some of the possible issues that I've found with following the traditional approach are using the same text, offering no choice, sitting only in group situations, round robin reading, basing your groups on reading levels, and using unfamiliar text. And we'll go through some of these issues and some possible solutions. So one of the problems in guided reading is the huge reliance on leveled books. And Dr. Louisa Moats reports that leveled books cannot be the basis for a systematic, explicit approach to beginning reading instruction. The problem lies is that with each advancing level, the students encounter more untaught phonic patterns and words. So what they end up doing is they become more reliant on memorization and guesswork. This is not reading. Leveled books are fine for those students who can read them, but not for our students who are at risk. The other problem with leveled books is lack of motivation or boredom. So providing a few different genres of books that focuses on a particular teaching pattern or focus will be a lot more helpful. The other issue is that you may have too many groups and too little time. So if you do have levels, you can put those levels together, say L, M, and N, but perhaps focus on a specific strategy or a skill that you want to work on with that group within that level. Please keep in mind too that levels create a lot of anxiety for our struggling readers. So if you allow choice in books that are at their independent or instructional level or patterns of passages, this will be a lot better and more purposeful for these students. The second problem with traditional guided reading is where the teacher selects the text, so there's no choice for our students. The solution is provide choice of many different genres. You can do this by taking an inventory at the beginning of the year, although make sure that you've got books that your children are able to read at their level, and have your least motivated readers come and help you choose books before your sessions. This provides a lot of autonomy. Choice increases dopamine. Dr. Judy Willis, a certified neurologist and middle school teacher, says that this dopamine is the brain's response to pleasure, and this in turn increases motivation, which increases attention, which increases reading. So choice is very helpful in decreasing off-task behavior and demotivation. Although choice is great, we need to keep in mind that with choice, that our books that are chosen are fair for our students who are struggling. What that means is that our students can read them and they're based on previously taught concepts. This is especially important when they are left to read them independently. Another issue that I found with working in traditional guided reading setting is only sitting in groups. So I started providing flexible seating. Sitting in groups can create a lot of anxiety for our struggling readers, frustration for what I call our soul workers, those kids that like to be on their own, and distraction for our social, distractible kids. So I had reading spots in the classroom where children could go. Our struggling readers especially find it very difficult when they have to read in front of their peers, and it creates a lot of anxiety. And I found this even after I stopped my round robin reading, which we will talk about after this slide. Our students need to feel safe, and being flexible provides this safety netting for them. It's important, however, to have rules based on flexible seating, and I provided some suggestions in the handouts for you. Here's some examples of flexible seating versus the typical classroom. Both of them work fine. You can even do a combination of both. Flexible seating is about having different options and finding the best place for your children to do their work. You don't need to spend hundreds of dollars on furniture in your room. You can find ways of being flexible just by having a few pillows with a carpet. Being flexible is not about furniture, it's about you as the teacher. Honor your students' choice, even if it's small, on where they want to sit and read. It creates a safe place for them to grow. Just think, if we're to read a book at home, would you choose a hard desk and chair or something soft and cozy? So, round robin reading, lots of controversy around this one. I have used this in the past. I haven't used it for years, but there is a lot of research that supports that it does not work. Big part is that the student is responsible for only reading a brief portion of the text. So what's happening is they're doing what I call fake reading. They're not practicing or building fluency or their reading stamina. They're also losing comprehension of the material because of this small portion that they have to read and then the breaks they have. This is not real world reading. We don't do this in the real world. My biggest problem with this is that it creates anxiety for our struggling readers. So the children who can move forward feel frustrated, and those struggling readers feel more inferior. And this also creates anxiety, and it creates a lack of independence because the stronger readers will then jump in and try to fix any errors. If you want any more information, Goodbye Round Robin is a great book by Opitz and Rasinski. An alternative to round robin reading is to just listen to the child independently while others continue to read on their own. You can do this either within the group, in flexible seating arrangement, or with whisper phones. And I've attached to your handouts a little bonus on how to create these whisper phones. And these are amazing in that they allow the child to listen to their reading, and it actually keeps them focused and on task. The other area that we need to look at is only creating our reading groups based on the levels that our children are reading at. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong. I have done it in the past. Um, and I do it at the beginning of the year when I am first assessing my students to determine what their needs are. However, it's something to really strongly consider as you get to know your students and possibly looking at the needs that they have or any strategy or focus groups that you might want to put together. It removes stigmas that, for example, Karen is in the low group and John is in the high group. You can easily have a strategy or focus group where you have lower skilled readers who struggle with making connections, just as there's higher leveled readers who struggle with making connections. Level books are fine for students who can read them, but they're not as helpful as the central tool of instruction for our children at risk, and we need to keep this in mind. Some teachers form groups according to interest in reading particular titles. So kids that want to read particular books, they can become part of a group. And another practice is something called invitational groups, where you probably would create mid-year, maybe January, where your students have become better at identifying their strengths and weaknesses, and you can offer invitational group sessions where students can self-select whether or not to attend a particular reading session based on a skill that they want to work on. This is wonderful because it yields more productive, heterogeneous groups, and it shows students that they can all learn from each other without being assigned to a higher or a lower reading group. Another characteristic of traditional guided reading is always choosing unfamiliar books for our instruction. We need to actually think about choosing both familiar and unfamiliar books based on our instructional goals. So, why should we encourage familiar text? Well, number one is it helps our ELL learners. It also helps all of our students develop a deeper understanding of what they've read. It helps develop fluency and accuracy and make sense of what they've read. It also helps them transfer to new readings later on. So, in other words, rereading leads to better first readings of future text. Mistake number 7 is not connecting skills throughout the day. So if you've explicitly taught your students how to use their prior knowledge, for example, before reading, you'd remind them to use this skill throughout the day. So for example, if you were teaching a science lesson about the ocean, remind them to use their schema. Ask them what they know about the ocean, what questions they'll have. Doing a KWL chart would be a perfect way of connecting this to the comprehension skill of schema. And we'll talk more about that later. Remember, our brain is wired to make connections. This is one way to understand and retain new concepts. Mistake number 8 can be found in the butterfly story. I invite you to try and to determine this mistake as we work through the story. One day, a man found a cocoon of a butterfly, and he found a small opening. He sat and watched the butterfly try to make its way through this small opening in the hole. Then it seemed to stop making any progress. It appeared as if it had gotten as far as it could and could go no further. So the man decided to help the butterfly. He took a pair of scissors and snipped off the remaining bit of cocoon. The butterfly then emerged easily, but it had a swollen body and small shriveled wings. The man continued to watch the butterfly because he expected that at any moment the wings would enlarge and expand to support the body and fly off. But that didn't happen. In fact, the butterfly spent the rest of its life crawling around with a swollen body and shriveled wings. It was never able to fly, and eventually it died. What the man did not understand was the science behind the struggle. The restricting cocoon and the struggle required for the butterfly to get through the opening is the natural process required to allow the fluid from the body of the butterfly into its wings so it would be ready for flight. Sometimes struggles are exactly what we need in our lives. There are processes of life, things that we all go through. And at times, the struggles are part of our journey that help us grow and fly. So mistake number 8 is rescuing. What did the butterfly story teach you? It taught me that rescuing when there's a struggle doesn't always help. I have been guilty of correcting too quickly, not giving my students enough time to kind of work through their process. Can you imagine that when a child is learning to walk and every time they fall, a parent picks them up and carries them around? They'll learn to walk, but eventually it may take them more time, and who knows what it would do to their development. Sometimes we need to fall a little and get up and figure out what works. This analogy fits closely to reading. We need to ask ourselves, what are our students doing with what they already know? Are they actively problem solving their text? Who is doing the majority of the reading work? We have to remember that the act of reading is strategic. It requires our readers to take time, which we often feel pressured for in the classroom. So how do we resolve rescuing? Well, first, allow wait time. I give myself the 5-second rule where I count to 5 in my head as my child is trying to determine what they need to do as they're working through the text. This also teaches me to be a bit more patient. We also have to ensure that our students who are struggling feel safe to make mistakes. So round robin reading isn't an ideal environment for this. So we need to think about how we are managing and creating our groups. Also, explain to your students that you're working hard at not rescuing because you're trying to get them to be more independent learners. So phrases like take your time, what can you try are very helpful. Heather Wall created this table that you see here, and what she believes is that we need to look at our students' behaviors as well. Are they looking at us to be rescued? So what we need to start with is low teacher support and then move up the continuum. So language like what can you try compared to telling the student the word has proven to be a lot more beneficial and create more success. So we start at the low level of support, and if we're working with appropriate texts and our readers have been taught problem solving strategies, they should be able to do the majority of the work. I've created prompt cards in your handouts, and I found these very helpful in changing my behavior. A word of caution: use balance when applying a no rescue mindset with our struggling readers. I've heard teachers say that we need to let them just struggle a little bit more. That's the last thing these kids need. They've been struggling long enough. Please provide the explicit, direct instruction that they need and provide them opportunities where they're experiencing success. And finally, mistake number 9, making excuses. When we make excuses, we don't create change. If you've made any or all of these mistakes, congratulate yourself. Remember, getting it wrong is part of the learning process. We need to teach this to our students. I've made every one of these mistakes, but I've learned from them. Many of the teachers I've talked to as well have also done the same. It's what you choose to do with this information. My question to you is, will you just sit on these mistakes and tell yourself, well, most of my kids are doing well, or this is what everyone else is doing, or I've been doing this for years and it's mostly working, or I don't have time, or there are many books and articles that support my approach. Louise Moat says, when our beliefs are deep-rooted, we're more resistant to change. My feeling is that when things aren't working, we need to challenge these beliefs. Some solutions for mistake number 9. When we make excuses, sometimes it's due to fear of change. If we can start being honest with ourselves, remember mistake number 1, acknowledge some of the mistakes that you're making. There's always room for improvement in any of our teaching, no matter how long we've been teaching. The fact that you're here today, taking the time with us and going through this webinar tells me that you're open to change for the betterment of your students. They really are lucky to have you in their lives. If you decide to make any changes, start small. Find 1 or 2 areas that you want to change and start implementing those. Start investigating training in a structured literacy approach like the Orton-Gillingham approach. We would be happy to help you through our academy and answer any questions you have about the training that we offer. Educate yourself. Do not become complacent. This will help challenge those beliefs and make you a better educator, and in turn, help your students become more successful. So we've just investigated some of the different instructional practices that we commonly see in the classroom. We've also looked at the 2 different approaches to reading instruction, whole language and the scientific-based reading research. Now, think about the instructional approach that you use either in your classroom or in your tutoring session. Which one of those instructional practices follows the science of reading? Write down any questions you might have. Any questions that aren't answered can be directed in the discussion forum. Let's take a look further at some other questions you can ask yourself. Jot your responses in your workbook. Before we move on to part 2, let's just take some time to stop, reflect, and connect. Which of the top 9 mistakes have you made? Jot these down in your workbook. Have you resolved any of the mistakes in your practice so far? If so, what are they? Jot down any questions you may have. What are 1 or 2 areas that you would like to change to help your students? Part 2 is putting everything we've learned so far into practice. So how to set up your groups, how to get your students independently working, creating student accountability, how to ask for help, and how to keep disruptions to a minimum. So how do you start your groups? You'll look at previous year's assessments, you can have chats with the teacher, and you need to start assessing using your preferred assessment or screening tool. You can use graded word lists and then move on from there. Keep in mind that running records only gives small amounts of information. Soon, our Academy will be providing a webinar on assessments and screening tools. Keep this space in mind. Keep in mind that you need to be organized and prepared when you are doing your assessments. During assessment time, ask for help. I often have parents coming in to help work with other students or answer any questions while I am doing my assessments. Another thing that's really important is to record the reading of your students. This is a great way to go back and check on anything that you've missed, and kids love to see the growth that they've made over time. If you can remember, we've talked about being diagnostic and prescriptive, and this is the part where we talk about how to do that. So what you'll do is you'll be diagnostic, where you'll gather the information from your past teacher, you'll take your information from the assessments, you'll identify the strengths and weaknesses within each student, and you'll evaluate the data to define any issues that you see going on within each individual student and as a class as whole. Then you'll move on to a plan. So you'll determine individual goals as well as class goals. You'll apply any strategies to resolve any problems. So if it was you saw your class as having a lot of fluency issues, you'll apply some strategies. You can ask for support from parents, the resource teacher, literacy teacher, or assistant to help you with this. You need to evaluate and monitor the outcomes to see if what you are doing is actually working, and then you adjust your instruction as needed. So now that you've gathered all of your assessment data, you'll be able to take a chart like you see here. This is just a small part of a class, so you'll see only a few children's names and some of the skills. And you'll be able to determine what your whole class needs, what individual students needs, and then you'll be able to take this big picture and create small flexible groups. So right here we see as a whole class, they're lacking in monitoring. So you could have a mini lesson or a lesson on monitoring. You can also see here that Sam has a lot of difficulties in many of the skills that you see at the top of this sheet. The other thing that you'll be able to identify by approaching it using a checklist like this is that you'll be able to see that you'd be able to create a group with Sam, Sarah, Josh, and Rohan with working on fluency. So this gives you a very good snapshot, and it's a quick and easy way of determining whole class needs, individual needs, and then small group needs. When you're setting up your group, just make sure you're asking yourself how your instruction is matched to your child's needs, and this is based on Sally Shea Witz's recommendation. She recommends that the components of reading like vocab or comprehension skills might be taught as a whole class, but given the variability of the different reading skills and other skills like basic phonological skills and oral reading instruction are best addressed in smaller groups. It's important that reading instruction is carried out in small groups to meet the needs of those struggling students. Groups should also be flexible so that they can move in and out of a group depending on what your students need. And of course, you're going to do this by doing ongoing assessment, both formal and informal. I have to stress the importance of continual observation and diagnosis. Every single lesson, you will find that you will make observations on where this child or your students are making progress or where they're having difficulty. You use this information as a springboard for your next bit of planning and instruction. Continuous diagnosis allows for those day-to-day adjustments, and it encourages teachers to tailor their instruction to individualize your program planning. Failure to diagnose consistently will result in diminished quality of instruction, and this will lead to more disruptive learning process within your students. Continuous diagnosis, on the other hand, will prevent reading problems from becoming more severe. Gradual changes in your prescription can be made to keep your instruction laser focused and on the specific needs of your students. So now that you understand how to set up the groups, we've got to look at the logistics. So we need to ask for help. We need to keep our disruptions down. We need to have our students accountable. We need to be accountable and take notes. How do you do this? In a classroom of 25 to 35 students, extra help is needed. Asking the resource teacher to team teach with you and work with various groups is an excellent way to support your students. Teachers' assistants, parents, peer tutors can all be trained in various areas of reading, like repeated reading for fluency. This worked beautifully in the classroom to help my students. At the beginning of every year, I would send out a note and I would ask for this help. Although you put your procedures and your routines in place, disruptions are inevitable. So I had various strategies. I'd use lights on the desk. If it was on, that indicated to the students absolutely no interruptions. I would put signs up. The phrase "ask three before me" is something that I used in the classroom. If they still didn't know the answer, they could write their question on a sticky note. I would always write on the board what the instructions were if there was anything different. Visual prompts are so important, as the majority of our students are visual learners. Students need to know what our responsibilities are as well as theirs, and this is where accountability comes in. So I used a reading journal to hold their word work, reading comprehension, and any reading response for independent reading they were doing. Following this, they would have to do a smiley face rating scale, and they would do 2 smiley faces based on 2 questions. The first question is, were you able to apply the skills or the strategies that we've been learning this week? And the second question is, were you working to your best ability? I would then follow that up with, what can you do the next time to make your reading session even better? I also would send home a home reading note for the students that I either conferenced and read with. So the parents were getting that communication, and students were also evaluating themselves. And you can find this in your handouts. Having our students look at their behavior teaches them to be more metacognitive, and this is very important for growth. Here's an example of the home reading notes that would go home. Rather than using a traditional guided reading sheet where you have the group name and all the students' names within that group, I always keep one sheet for each student. They have their own sheet. And in this way, I'm able to look at patterns, able to look at any growth they've had, and also how often I've seen them. It's also a much easier way to be able to move my students around from group to group, and I can easily do this in the binder, as I have my binder organized into sections of groups within each tabbed area. In summary, if you are teaching your reading groups in a classroom, it's really important to teach routines, procedures, and expectations at the beginning of the year, and you may need to revisit this. Once you've done this, you can start your assessments and look at previous year's data in order to create your groups. You're going to be diagnostic and prescriptive in creating your groups based on your students' learning needs, and you will use ongoing formative assessment to propel your instruction and create your flexible ongoing groups throughout the year. So now we're going to stop, reflect, and connect. Do you use the diagnostic and prescriptive approach to drive your instruction? Is it working? Is this something you would consider? Do you see the benefits? Do you have help during your sessions? If not, would you consider it? How would you implement this? And how do you keep your students accountable? Any additional questions, just jot down. In part 3, we'll briefly look at some ideas for teaching comprehension, fluency, and word work. We're first going to look at comprehension. Many of the skills that the proficient readers have are strategies that are not always explicitly taught. One of my grade 6 students, for example, had no idea that when they read, they should visualize. She always said reading was boring, it was just words on a page. She had no issues with comprehension, but motivation was a massive factor. Once she realized that reading is like a movie playing in your mind, her motivation came up, and she could comprehend the text at an even deeper level. When we're teaching comprehension, we need to explain why strategies are useful, explicitly teach, and follow up to ensure their understanding. I provided a PowerPoint of reading strategies that you can explicitly teach your students during your reading sessions. Throughout the PowerPoint, you will guide your students through the various reading strategies necessary to become strong, fluent readers who can understand what they have read. I have found that the most effective way to work on these goals and needs is to introduce one skill at a time and just build on that. I always start with the skill of monitoring and fix up strategies. There are many strategies for each skill, and I will share one with you. You will find more ideas in your handouts. So here you see the order of strategies based on Keene and Zimmerman's book, Mosaic of Thought. What's important is not the order necessarily, but that you're looking at the needs of your students, and this is just a general guideline. It's important that you are communicating to your students that they understand that the goal is to understand the content of the text and not get so hung up on the strategies themselves. When teaching comprehension, teachers need to make sure that when they're making the decision in their instruction, they have to consider that when content is new, they would select a familiar strategy. As the content becomes more familiar, they'd introduce a new strategy. This balance between the familiar and new is a measure against to which to evaluate effective teaching using explicit instruction. Now, instruction should always be adjusted based on the use of progress monitoring. So we're always looking at our children's needs. And when we're doing this, we're better able to keep them engaged. Guidelines for comprehension instruction, very important. Number one, select your text carefully. You really need to plan this one. When you're doing your whole group lessons, you need to have a text that matches the strategy. I have provided books for you for each strategy to save you time, and you can find that in your handouts. Make sure that you're teaching your students to apply the strategies to different books so they can use the strategies flexibly. You also need to make sure the text is at an appropriate level. If it's too difficult, they're spending too much time decoding, but if it's too easy, they won't need to apply the strategy. Direct and explicit instruction. We've talked a lot about this and the importance of it. Provide an appropriate amount of time for guided practice. This is where the gradual release model comes in. We need to ensure that our students are understanding and we can guide them in their small groups. And finally, don't get hung up on the process of teaching the strategy and only focusing on that. Teach the children that the main goal is comprehension. It's making them aware of the strategy and how they can use it in the text when they're reading. I'd like to share with you one of the strategies that I use for monitoring comprehension. Please keep in mind that comprehension is a massive topic, so this would be a webinar in itself. So for the sake of time, I can only share one with you. You will find some more strategies in your handouts, and there are 2 PowerPoints that will be helpful for the order of teaching of the strategies for both elementary and intermediate. So let's get started with the strategy of click and clunk. One of my favorite tools for self-monitoring is the click and clunk bookmarks. What I did is I made a click and a clunk bookmark. So I had a piece of red hard cardstock and green cardstock. I glued them both together and then I created bookmarks. And the children wrote click on the green side and clunk on the red side. And this is how they work. So what it means to click is that you get what you're reading. You can read all the words, you can summarize, and you don't need to stop. So you just continue. When you're clunking, you're not understanding. You might be stuck on a word or a phrase or a paragraph, and you might need to stop and go back and fix your understanding. So right now you have to stop and fix it until it clicks. So how do we use our click and clunk bookmark during reading? Well, you'll start with your bookmark on click. You'll read until you'll identify a clunk, so maybe you can't decode or something doesn't make sense. At this point, you will put your bookmark on clunk. You will read or fix up until you understand, and at that point, you will put your bookmark back over onto the click. Once you click, you continue reading. If your students are using the click and clunk strategy independently, you can guide them explicitly using a chart like you see, where they write the page number where they have difficulty and the point of confusion where they're having difficulty in their text and the strategy that they tried. So, for example, if they had difficulty sounding out a different word, the strategy that they might try would be chunking the word into syllables. The other strategy that you can implement is just have them add a post-it note in the text where they are having difficulty. This provides the evidence if they are working independently. Make sure to explicitly teach them this though. One of the big problems with our reading sessions within the classroom is the time and energy that you spend on creating materials. Now, comprehension boxes and task cards are great teacher-friendly, time-friendly saving tools. The comprehension boxes come leveled and they contain both fiction and nonfiction texts along with questions for each passage. When my students would use these in their independent groups, they would read their text and then they would answer the question on the laminated card with a whiteboard marker. They would submit the cards to me. This created student accountability and it provided me with the information of what they were able to handle on their own. The comprehension task cards that you can find on Teachers Pay Teachers cover many concepts such as main idea, inference, setting characters, and these are also completed for you. You can laminate these and use these in your independent sessions. These are also great to use for teaching tools in your teacher group reading sessions as well. The important thing to keep in mind is that when your students are working independently, they are provided the explicit training and instruction to be able to handle the materials they use independently. Fluency and word work are the next two areas that I'll cover. Both of these could have their own webinar, so I will just briefly touch upon some ideas that you can use in your classroom or in your tutoring sessions. There'll be more detail in your handouts on how to carry out each one of these very important components of our reading instruction. Some fluency ideas: ear reading, so listening to reading on a CD and the student follows along. Repeated reading. Readingresource.net is a fabulous resource that gives you videos on how to do this and the handouts where your child can plot their reading and look at the difference between their first and their fifth read. I strongly recommend this one. Paired reading, where the student follows along and reads with their partner and then taps the partner's hand for the partner to phase out. Buddy reading and poetry reading. Fluency phrases, which are an excellent way to start with your fluency. Lego Fluency is an excellent, fun resource that you can find on readingresource.net. A word of caution: when you are pairing your students for buddy reading or paired reading, please be cautious not to pair your strong readers with your weak readers. As teachers, we can take our struggling students because it creates an environment that creates stress. If you do want to do buddy reading, I would always pair my older students randomly with my younger students. And I would take the older struggling students to give them that boost because they would have had those skills in place. I would have made sure that I would have taught them so they could then peer teach the younger student. Word work could have its own webinar on its own. This is very, very broad what I'm showing you here. Buddy spelling is a strategy that I used in the classroom where everybody had their own buddy spell book, and this was more an individualized spelling program where the students would have words that they frequently misspelled, so they might be high frequency words, irregular words, or rule breakers. and they would put these into their buddy spell books. Their buddy would test them on their words once a week. The words that they didn't get right, they would apply a multisensory approach to try to remember those words. Vocabulary, I would have the students bring in their iPads so they could use various apps and play various games. These were quite appealing and very helpful. We used sticky notes, concept sort, fourfold, or 2 other ideas that are detailed in your handouts. Phonics, morphology, and grammar. These are very big concepts based on what your students need. So your level of instruction will be based on your students' needs. What I would do is I would teach small mini lessons, 5 to 10 minutes in these areas, and then add them to our toolbox of word work ideas. I'd put it on a word work card and in their word work folder for each group. It was done for the year. I would continue to add and build based on what was taught. A couple ways to organize your fluency, word work, and comprehension is I would have different colors, and comprehension would be the blue folder, fluency green, and word work red. The tasks would go in each of the folders, and each group would have a comprehension, fluency, and word work folder in their group box, so they were easily accessible. I also organized my groups in both colors and names, so they would just grab their materials, take them to their desk, and it was very quick and easy. In your handouts, there'll be some bonus material that will include some checklists of behaviors and skills to teach, some more ideas for teaching comprehension, vocabulary, fluency, phonological and phonemic awareness, a diagnostic and prescriptive planning checklist, lists of books to teach various comprehension skills, how to set up your reading response journals that your students can use during independent sessions if you are working in the classroom, T&T monitoring tool and success ladder that will help with monitoring your reading, as well as a comprehension PowerPoint for both the elementary and intermediate level of the skills that you teach. We're coming near the end of this webinar. Take a minute to complete this post-test to see what you were able to understand and retain from completing the webinar today. Just press pause and then continue on after you've finished. After taking part in this webinar, is there anything that you would do differently or the same? Jot this down in your workbook. We are now at the end of our webinar on creating reading groups that work, a diagnostic and prescriptive approach. We hope that you found this information in the webinar useful, and it will help you create reading groups that will meet the needs of all of your students, including those with dyslexia. Thank you for choosing the Orton Gillingham Online Academy and taking the time out of your busy schedule to improve your practice. It's your dedication that will make a difference in the lives of your students. We hope to see you again in our future webinars.